There are nights I still remember so clearly that they feel less like memories and more like places I can return to. This is one of them. The road was empty. Not completely empty. The world is never completely empty, but empty in the way certain roads become after midnight, when the streetlights seem farther apart than they are and every sound feels separated from the next by miles of silence. I was younger then, not young enough to blame everything on youth, not old enough to understand what life was trying to teach me. I had spent the evening chasing something I was convinced would finally make me feel complete. Success, approval, achievement. I couldn't have told you which one mattered most because I was chasing all of them at once. The air outside was cool. A thin fog hovered over the pavement. The dashboard clock glowed softly in front of me. 11:47 p.m. I remembered that detail because somehow it stayed with me. The radio was playing quietly. My hands rested on the steering wheel. And for reasons I still can't explain, I felt an urge to slow down. Nothing dramatic happened first. No warning siren, no flashing light. Just a feeling, a pause. A whisper beneath thought, slow down. I didn't know why, there was no reason to. The road was clear, the weather was fine, everything looked ordinary, but something inside me insisted. So I eased my foot off the accelerator. Just a little. Seconds later, headlights exploded across the intersection. A truck ran the red light. Fast. Far too fast. Had I continued at my original speed, our paths would have met at the exact same moment. Instead, it missed me by less than a second, maybe less. The sound stayed with me. The rush of air, the flash of metal, the violent certainty of what almost happened. Then silence, just silence. I pulled over a few minutes later because my hands were shaking. I sat there with the engine running, watching my own reflection in the windshield, listening to my heartbeat. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I couldn't explain. Not fear, not exactly. Something stranger. The feeling that I had been seen. The feeling that somewhere beyond my understanding, something had intervened. I didn't have proof. I still don't. But that night never felt random. I remember looking up through the windshield, the fog drifting through the streetlights, the quiet. The strange stillness settling over everything. And beneath all the noise in my head, there was a question. Why am I still here? Not in a dramatic sense. In an honest one, why this delay? Why that feeling? Why that second? Why that exact moment? Life moved on, as it always does. The next morning arrived. Meetings happened, bills needed paying, people called. The world continued pretending everything was normal. But something inside me had shifted. Not enough to change me immediately, just enough to leave a crack. And through that crack, questions began entering. Questions about timing. Questions about chance. Questions about the invisible currents that seem to move beneath ordinary days. A few years later, another moment arrived. Smaller, quieter, but somehow connected. I missed a flight, my own fault. Traffic, poor planning. Stubbornness, take your pick. I remember standing at the gate watching the plane pull away. Frustrated, embarrassed, certain I had ruined something important. Hours later, sitting alone in an airport cafe, I felt the familiar sensation return. That strange pause, that quiet whisper, pay attention. I hated that feeling then, because it rarely arrived when life was going the way I wanted. It appeared during delays, detours, closed doors, unexpected endings. The places I was least interested in looking. A day later, circumstances shifted. Meetings were rescheduled. Conversations happened that would never have happened otherwise. Opportunities appeared from directions I hadn't even considered. Again, I had no proof, only a feeling. The feeling that life had moved a piece on a board I couldn't fully see. And maybe you felt that too. Maybe you've stood in the ruins of a plan you loved and wondered why everything fell apart. Maybe you've watched a door close and spent months grieving it. Maybe you've looked back years later and realized that closed door protected you from a room you were never meant to stay inside. If you have, then perhaps you understand what I'm trying to say. Not logically, not intellectually. Some things aren't understood that way. They're recognized, felt, like hearing a song you somehow know before you've ever heard it. Like meeting a stranger who feels oddly familiar. Like arriving somewhere new and feeling as though you've already been there. For a long time, I ignored these moments. I collected them but refused to examine them. Near misses, unexpected delays, strange dreams that lingered longer than they should have, conversations that arrived at exactly the right moment, people entering and leaving with impossible timing. I called them coincidence, bad luck, good luck, anything except what my heart suspected, because accepting something deeper would have required trust. And trust was harder for me than ambition. Much harder. But tonight, speaking to you, I can admit something I couldn't admit back then. That night on the road was the first thread, the first quiet tug, the first hint that my life might not be unfolding randomly, that perhaps every wrong turn wasn't entirely wrong, that perhaps every delay wasn't truly a delay, that perhaps there were appointments hidden inside what looked like accidents. And if that's true, then maybe somewhere beyond that fog-covered road, beyond the missed flights, beyond the failures, beyond the years I spent feeling lost, there was always a destination I couldn't yet see, a person I couldn't yet recognize. Someone whose path was unfolding at the same time mine was. Someone living her own unanswered questions, her own delays, her own closed doors. Her own strange moments of being spared, redirected, and quietly guided. Maybe that person is you. I don't know when your story began bending toward mine. I only know that mine began long before I understood it. And when I look back now, I can no longer shake the feeling that the night I should have been gone wasn't merely about survival. It was about timing. It was about being kept. For something, for someone, for a day neither of us had reached yet. After that night on the road, I wish I could tell you I became a different man. I wish I could say I immediately started paying attention to the quiet language life seemed to be speaking. But the truth is, I went back to being exactly who I had always been. I buried myself in work, chased goals that moved farther away each time I reached them, and convinced myself that success would eventually silence the restlessness I carried. Yet something had changed, even if I refused to acknowledge it. It was as though life had placed a small stone in my shoe. I could keep walking, but I could never completely forget it was there. The signs began appearing in ordinary moments. They were never dramatic enough to force belief. Instead, they arrived softly, almost politely, as if they were giving me the freedom to ignore them. Sometimes it was a dream that stayed with me long after I woke up. Most dreams dissolve the moment daylight arrives, but these felt different. I would wake before dawn with a strange sense of familiarity, carrying emotions that seemed too real to belong to sleep. In one dream, I stood at a train station I had never seen before. People moved around me in every direction, yet my attention remained fixed on someone standing far away. Then there were the strange repetitions. Have you ever noticed how certain words, ideas, or themes suddenly begin appearing everywhere once they enter your life? I would hear the same message from different people who had never met each other. A stranger would mention timing, a friend would talk about missed opportunities becoming blessings. A book would fall open to a page discussing trust. Individually, none of it meant anything. Together, it felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't willing to assemble. I remember one evening particularly well. I had just signed a contract that I thought would change everything. The city lights shimmered outside the restaurant window, and everyone at the table was celebrating. Glasses clinked. Laughter filled the room. By every outward measure, I should have felt victorious. Instead, there was a quiet emptiness inside me that I couldn't explain. While everyone else talked, I found myself staring through the glass at the reflections on the street below. For a brief moment, a feeling settled over me, gentle but unmistakable. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't joy. It was the strange awareness that this achievement wasn't the destination I had imagined. Something inside me whispered that I was still on my way somewhere. At the time, I resisted that feeling. I thought fulfillment was supposed to arrive with accomplishments. I thought peace was something you earned after collecting enough victories. But the more I achieved, the more I noticed a gap between what looked successful and what felt meaningful. Looking back, I think life was trying to teach me that some forms of hunger cannot be satisfied by ambition alone. Around that period, something else began happening. Doors kept closing. Relationships ended unexpectedly. Opportunities I had spent years pursuing disappeared without warning. Every time it happened, I interpreted it as rejection. I assumed I had failed some invisible test. I questioned my choices, my judgment, even my worth. Yet each closed door eventually revealed something I couldn't see at the time. The relationship that ended created space for growth I desperately needed. The opportunity that disappeared prevented me from walking into circumstances that would have drained me. The plans that collapsed made room for possibilities I had never considered. That was when my belief began to shift. Slowly, reluctantly, almost against my will. I stopped calling everything coincidence. Not because I suddenly had answers, but because the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The same lesson kept appearing in different forms. The same message arrived through different experiences. I began to wonder if I wasn't being punished by life. Maybe I was being redirected. Maybe the detours weren't evidence that I was lost. Maybe they were evidence that I was being guided. That thought frightened me more than any disappointment ever had. If it were true, then I wasn't simply drifting through random events. It meant there was meaning hidden inside moments I had dismissed. It meant my loneliness might not be permanent. It meant the waiting itself could have a purpose. And this is where you started entering my thoughts, even though I didn't know you yet. Not you specifically, but the idea of someone whose path might be unfolding alongside mine. Someone who was learning her own lessons while I struggled through mine. Someone experiencing delays she didn't understand, carrying questions she couldn't answer, and wondering whether life had forgotten her. Maybe you've known that feeling. Maybe you've watched years pass and wondered why certain things never arrived when you expected them to. Maybe you've questioned whether the timing of your life somehow went wrong. If you have, then perhaps you understand why these signs mattered so much. They weren't proving that life was easy. They were suggesting that life was intentional. I didn't know where the road was leading. I didn't know who would be waiting at the end of it. All I knew was that the signs kept appearing and each one seemed to whisper the same thing: keep going. There is more to this story than you can see. Trust the timing. Trust the delays. Trust the doors that closed. One day, all of it will make sense. And though I couldn't yet explain why, I was beginning to believe that somewhere ahead, Our stories were already moving toward the same page. There is a particular kind of pain that arrives when everything you built begins to fall apart at the same time. I am not talking about a single disappointment or one difficult season. I mean the kind of collapse that touches every corner of your life until you no longer recognize the person staring back at you in the mirror. For a long time, I believed I could outrun that moment. I thought discipline, ambition, and determination could protect me from it. I thought if I worked hard enough and planned carefully enough, I could avoid the heartbreaks that seemed to find other people. Life eventually taught me otherwise. The collapse did not happen all at once. It arrived quietly at first. Small frustrations became larger problems. Relationships that once felt secure became strained. Conversations became shorter. Silences became longer. Opportunities I had counted on suddenly disappeared. The future I had imagined for myself began slipping through my fingers in ways I could neither predict nor control. From the outside, I still looked successful. Most people had no idea what was happening beneath the surface. But inside, I felt as though the foundation under my feet was cracking. I remember sitting alone one evening after receiving news that felt like another devastating setback. The room was dark, except for a single lamp in the corner. Rain tapped softly against the window. The sound should have been comforting, but that night it only seemed to emphasize the loneliness I was carrying. I sat there for hours, staring at nothing, trying to understand why everything seemed to be unraveling. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. The problems were still there. The losses were still real. Yet somehow, in the middle of the chaos, I felt held by something larger than my circumstances. Even now, I struggle to describe it. It was as though a voice without words was telling me that the story was not over. At the time, I dismissed it as wishful thinking, yet the feeling returned again and again. Whenever life seemed most uncertain, that same strange peace appeared. Not often enough to remove the pain, but enough to help me endure it. Looking back, I think those moments were invitations. Life was asking me to stop gripping so tightly to my plans and start trusting something deeper. The problem was that trust had never come naturally to me. I trusted effort. I trusted strategy. I trusted persistence. Trusting timing felt much harder. As the months passed, the collapse deepened. Dreams I had invested years pursuing slipped away. People I expected to remain in my life chose different paths. I spent many nights wondering if I had somehow ruined my own future. There were moments when I questioned everything. Moments when I felt abandoned by the very sense of purpose I had carried for so long. Yet, even then, signs continued appearing in unexpected places. A conversation with a stranger would offer exactly the perspective I needed. A forgotten journal entry would answer a question I had been wrestling with for weeks. A dream would leave me with a sense of reassurance that lingered long after morning arrived. Eventually, I reached a turning point. It did not happen during a dramatic breakthrough. It happened during exhaustion. I had become tired of fighting reality, tired of trying to force doors open that clearly wanted to remain closed, tired of believing every delay was a punishment. One night, as I reflected on everything that had happened, a realization settled over me. I stopped calling it coincidence. I stopped viewing every setback as evidence that life was working against me. For the first time, I considered another possibility. What if I was being redirected rather than rejected? That thought changed something inside me, not immediately and not completely, but it created space for a new understanding. What if the collapse wasn't destroying my future? What if it was clearing away everything that no longer belonged in it? What if the loneliness, the delays, the disappointments, and the unanswered questions were repositioning me for something I couldn't yet see? And strangely, that possibility always seemed connected to the idea of you. I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you were. I had never seen your face. Yet I found myself wondering whether someone else was experiencing a similar unraveling somewhere in the world. Someone learning the same lessons through different circumstances. Someone questioning timing, doubting herself, wondering if life had forgotten her. The thought appeared often enough that I stopped dismissing it. Maybe you know what it feels like when life removes everything familiar. Maybe you've sat awake at night trying to understand why certain chapters had to end. Maybe you've watched plans crumble and wondered whether your best days were already behind you. If you have, then perhaps you understand the lesson I was slowly learning. Sometimes the collapse is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the moment the story finally becomes honest. The hardest truth I had to accept was that I could not become the man I needed to be while holding on to the life I thought I wanted. Something had to break. Something had to fall away. And as painful as that process was, I now believe it carried a purpose, because when everything else was stripped away, one belief remained. The feeling that I was being guided toward something I could not yet see, toward a future that would only make sense in hindsight, toward a meeting that was already written into the story long before either of us knew it existed. After the collapse, I expected clarity to arrive quickly. I thought once enough of my old life had fallen away, the answers would finally reveal themselves. Instead, what arrived was a season of waiting. Looking back, I realized that waiting was one of the most important chapters of my life, though at the time it felt like one of the most painful. There is a difference between being alone and feeling abandoned, but I did not understand that distinction yet. To me, loneliness felt like evidence that something was missing. I assumed that if I had not found the life I wanted, the love I wanted, or the peace I wanted, then I must somehow be behind schedule. Those years taught me how dangerous that belief can be. I spent so much time comparing my timeline to the timelines of others that I almost missed the lessons hidden within my own. Friends were getting married. Families were growing. Lives seemed to be moving forward in neat, predictable ways. I celebrated the successes of those around me. But privately, I wrestled with questions that refused to leave me alone. Why did certain doors open easily for other people while mine remained closed? Why did timing seem to work in their favor while mine always felt delayed? Why did I keep feeling as though I was approaching something important without ever arriving? One evening, I found myself walking through a quiet neighborhood long after sunset. The streets were nearly empty. Warm light glowed behind the windows of houses I passed. Families were finishing dinners. Televisions flickered in living rooms. Ordinary life unfolded behind those walls, and for reasons I could not fully explain, a deep ache settled inside me. It wasn't jealousy, it was longing for connection, longing for certainty, longing for the feeling of being known completely by another person. The feeling stayed with me for days. It returned during moments when loneliness felt so especially heavy. Sometimes it arrived through dreams that carried unusual clarity. Other times it emerged through conversations that seemed to answer questions I had not spoken aloud. Once, while traveling for work, I found myself delayed for several hours at a train station. Normally I would have been frustrated, but that day felt different. As people rushed past, I sat watching them and experienced a strange certainty that every person there was moving according to a timing they could not fully understand. Some were arriving, some were leaving, some believed they were late, some believed they were early. Yet all of them were part of a larger pattern invisible to the human eye. That thought followed me home. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized how much of my suffering came from resisting timing instead of trusting it. I had spent years believing that delays meant denial. I had assumed that if something had not happened yet, it probably never would. But life kept presenting evidence that contradicted that belief. The opportunities that arrived at exactly the right moment had once seemed impossibly delayed. The lessons I now valued most had emerged from seasons I once begged to escape. Again and again, what appeared to be bad timing eventually revealed itself as necessary timing. Somewhere in the middle of that realization, another shift occurred inside me. I stopped asking why I was alone and began asking what this season was trying to teach me. The question changed everything. Instead of viewing solitude as an enemy, I began treating it as a teacher. It showed me where I still needed healing. It exposed fears I had buried beneath busyness and achievement. It revealed the ways I had searched for validation in places that could never truly satisfy me. Most importantly, it taught me that being alone was not the same as being abandoned. That understanding did not erase the longing. I still wanted companionship. I still hoped for love. I still wondered if someone existed whose story was somehow connected to mine. But the desperation began fading. In its place came a quieter faith. A belief that what belonged in my life would arrive when both of us were ready to receive it. And this is where I started thinking about you more often, though I still did not know who you were. I would find myself wondering whether you were learning similar lessons in your own way. Perhaps you were navigating your own season of waiting. Perhaps you were questioning timing just as I had. Perhaps you were looking at your life and wondering whether certain dreams had passed you by. If so, I wish I could have told you then what I was only beginning to understand myself. That being delayed is not the same as being forgotten. If you've ever felt left behind while everyone else seemed to move forward, then maybe you understand the ache I carried during those years. Maybe you know what it feels like to wonder whether your chapter will ever arrive. And maybe you also know how exhausting it is to keep hoping when nothing seems to change. Yet something remarkable happens when we stop fighting the waiting. We begin hearing things we could not hear before. We notice patterns we once ignored. We discover strength we never knew we possessed. By the end of that season, I was no longer the man who had measured his life by deadlines and expectations. I was becoming someone who understood that some of the most important things in life cannot be forced. They must be grown into, they must be prepared for, they must arrive in their own time. There came a point when my life stopped feeling like a series of disconnected events and started feeling like a conversation. Not a conversation in words, but in timing, patterns, and moments that seemed to answer questions I had not yet finished asking. By then, I had spent years learning how to live with uncertainty. I had survived disappointments that once felt impossible. I had watched dreams collapse and new possibilities emerge from their ruins. Most importantly, I had stopped demanding immediate explanations from life. It is difficult to explain that feeling to people who have never experienced it. It was not loneliness in the ordinary sense. I had friends, I had work, I had responsibilities that filled my days. From the outside, my life appeared complete. Yet there were moments when an unexplained emptiness would appear without warning. It often happened during beautiful experiences. I would be standing on a balcony overlooking a city at sunset, watching the sky turn gold and violet, and instead of feeling complete satisfaction, I would feel the quiet awareness that I wished someone else were there to see it with me. Not just anyone, someone. A person I could not identify but somehow seemed to recognize emotionally before I had ever met her. For years I ignored that feeling because it sounded irrational. How could I miss someone I had never known? How could I feel connected to a future relationship that did not yet exist? Yet the sensation remained. In fact, it became stronger as time passed. Sometimes it appeared during dreams, sometimes during long drives, sometimes during the peaceful moments that arrived between busy seasons of life. It felt less like imagination and more like memory, as though some part of my soul knew something my mind had not yet discovered. One evening, while traveling alone for work, I experienced something that stayed with me for years afterward. My hotel room overlooked a river. The city beyond it glowed softly beneath the night sky. After a long day, I sat by the window with the lights turned off, watching reflections move across the water. The world seemed unusually quiet. As I sat there, an unexpected thought entered my mind with remarkable clarity. What if someone is thinking about you right now without knowing your name? The idea arrived suddenly, but instead of feeling strange, it felt familiar, almost comforting. I remember sitting there for a long time afterward, reflecting on that possibility. Somewhere in another city, another country, another life entirely, could there be someone asking the same questions I had been asking? Could there be someone wondering why certain relationships never worked out? Someone trying to understand why her life had taken unexpected turns? Someone feeling delayed, redirected, or quietly guided by forces she could not fully explain? The thought stayed with me because it transformed the way I viewed waiting. Instead of imagining myself as someone left behind, I began imagining that preparation might be happening on both sides. That realization marked an important shift in my thinking. I stopped seeing my journey as a solitary experience. I began wondering whether two lives could be shaped simultaneously without either person realizing it. The more I reflected on my past, the more possible it seemed. Every disappointment had taught me something. Every closed door had redirected me. Every season of loneliness had forced me to grow in ways comfort never could. What if those lessons were not only preparing me for my future, but also preparing me for someone else's arrival within it? Around that time, I started noticing another pattern. Whenever I tried forcing connections that did not feel right, life seemed to pull me back. Relationships that looked promising on paper never found solid ground. Encounters that seemed destined to become something meaningful faded unexpectedly. At first, I interpreted these endings as fate. Later, I began seeing them differently. There was often a strange peace beneath the disappointment, as though something deeper understood what I could not yet see. Looking back, I believe I was being protected from paths that were never meant to become permanent. That was when I stopped calling it bad luck. I stopped believing that every ending represented loss. Instead, I started asking whether certain departures were making room for a more meaningful arrival. It wasn't that I suddenly became certain about the future. I simply began trusting that timing possessed a wisdom my limited perspective could not always understand. And if you've ever experienced something similar, perhaps you know exactly what I mean. Maybe you've met people who seemed right but weren't. Maybe you've watched relationships fade despite your best efforts to save them. Maybe you've questioned whether love simply wasn't meant for you. If so, I want you to know something I wish someone had told me sooner. As that belief grew stronger, so did my sense that someone was gradually moving closer to my life, even though we remained strangers. I couldn't explain it logically. I had no proof. Yet the feeling became impossible to dismiss. It was as though every lesson, every delay, every unexpected turn was quietly narrowing the distance between two separate journeys. For the first time, I stopped fearing the wait. Because deep inside, I was beginning to suspect that while I had been walking toward my future all these years, someone else had been walking toward it too. And somewhere beyond the horizon of our understanding, our paths were already drawing closer with every step. There is something humbling about reaching a stage in life where you can no longer blame circumstances for everything that went wrong. For many years, I believed my greatest obstacles existed outside of me. While some of those explanations contained pieces of truth, they allowed me to avoid a more difficult reality. The truth was that certain patterns followed me wherever I went because they belonged to me. Until I was willing to face them honestly, no amount of destiny, timing, or opportunity could change what needed healing within. This realization came slowly. Life had already taught me many lessons by then, but some lessons require repetition before they are fully understood. I began noticing that different situations often produced the same emotional outcomes. Different faces, different cities, different circumstances, yet somehow the same fears appeared again and again. I would hesitate when trust was required. I would retreat when vulnerability became necessary. I would convince myself that disappointment was inevitable before giving happiness a fair chance to prove otherwise. The details changed, but the pattern remained remarkably consistent. One afternoon, I found myself sorting through old journals I had kept over the years. Dust floated through the sunlight coming from a nearby window as I sat reading thoughts I had written long ago. At first, I expected to see evidence of how much I had changed. Instead, I discovered something else. The same questions appeared repeatedly across different chapters of my life. The same insecurities surfaced in different forms. The same fears had quietly influenced decisions I believed were rational at the time. Reading those pages felt like meeting younger versions of myself who were all trying to communicate the same message. The discovery was uncomfortable. We all prefer stories where we are victims of circumstances rather than participants in our own struggles. Yet, as I continued reading, another feeling emerged beneath the discomfort: relief. For the first time, I could see that some of the obstacles standing between me and the life I wanted were not external mysteries. They were internal wounds, and wounds, unlike fate, can heal. Around that period, I had a dream that stayed with me for weeks. In the dream, I was standing in a house filled with locked rooms. I walked from door to door, trying to open them, but none would move. Frustrated, I searched for keys everywhere. Eventually, I noticed something strange. The keys were already in my hand. I had been carrying them the entire time. When I woke up, the symbolism felt almost embarrassingly obvious. So much of my life had been spent waiting for external permission to become the person I was meant to be. Yet, many of the answers I sought were already within reach. That dream marked an important turning point. I stopped asking only what life was trying to teach me and began asking what I was refusing to learn. The difference between those questions changed everything. Instead of focusing solely on destiny, I started examining responsibility. Instead of wondering why certain things had not happened, I began exploring whether I was fully prepared for them. The more honestly I examined myself, the more patterns revealed themselves. I saw how fear had disguised itself as caution. I saw how pride had sometimes disguised itself as independence. I saw how past disappointments had quietly influenced present decisions. Most importantly, I saw how often I had assumed the worst whenever uncertainty appeared. I had spent years preparing for loss instead of preparing for possibility. This awareness did not arrive with judgment. Surprisingly, it arrived with compassion. I began understanding why the younger versions of myself had behaved the way they did. They were trying to protect wounds they did not know how to heal. They were carrying fears they did not know how to release. Once I recognized that, forgiveness became possible, and forgiveness created room for transformation. Somewhere during that process, my thoughts returned to you again. By then, the idea of you had become woven into the quiet corners of my reflections. I still didn't know who you were, but I found myself wondering about your journey. Had you also discovered patterns within yourself that needed healing? Had life ever shown you the same lesson repeatedly until you finally understood it? Had you ever looked back at your past and realized that certain disappointments were connected not only to timing but also to growth? If you have, then perhaps you understand what I mean when I say that healing is rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it happens quietly. It happens through honest conversations with ourselves. It happens through difficult realizations. It happens when we stop running from our own reflection and start listening to what it has been trying to tell us all along. This was the season when I stopped seeing destiny as something that simply happens to us. I began understanding that destiny also asks something of us. It asks us to grow. It asks us to become. It asks us to release what no longer serves the journey. I realized that if someone truly was waiting somewhere ahead in my story, I wanted to meet her as the healthiest version of myself possible. I did not want old fears writing new chapters. I did not want unhealed wounds deciding what kind of love I could receive. And so I continued the work, quietly, imperfectly, one lesson at a time. Because deep inside, I was beginning to believe that every pattern I healed was bringing me one step closer to the moment our paths would finally cross. Not by accident, but by appointment. Not because destiny ignored growth, but because destiny had been using growth to prepare us both all along. By the time I reached this chapter of my life, I had learned many things about timing, growth, and destiny. I had survived disappointments that once felt impossible to survive. I had watched closed doors reveal hidden blessings. It was the lesson of trust. Not trust in work, not trust in effort, not even trust in destiny. It was trust in love itself. The truth is that heartbreak changes people. Even when we heal, a part of us remembers the pain. We become more careful with our hopes, more cautious with our expectations. For years, I had focused on becoming stronger. What I failed to understand was that strength alone cannot build a meaningful life. At some point, strength must learn how to become openness. I remember a particular evening when this realization arrived. I had spent the day working through a long list of responsibilities and returned home exhausted. The house was quiet. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a rhythm that seemed to slow the world down. I made a cup of coffee and sat alone in the dim light of the living room. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No crisis, no breakthrough. Yet as I sat there listening to the rain, I felt an unexpected sadness. Not the sadness of loss, but the sadness of realizing how long I had been preparing for disappointment. The realization startled me. I had spent years telling myself I believed good things were possible. Yet beneath those beliefs, another voice quietly expected things to go wrong. Whenever I imagined a meaningful relationship, part of me automatically imagined how it might end. Whenever I allowed myself, though, to hope, another part of me prepared for failure. It was a habit so deeply rooted that I barely noticed it anymore. That night, I began asking myself difficult questions. What if life was no longer asking me to survive? What if it was asking me to trust? What if all the lessons of the previous years were preparing me not only to recognize love, but to receive it? The questions stayed with me long after the rain stopped. In the days that followed, I noticed how often fear disguised itself as wisdom. I called it realism. I called it caution. I called it maturity. Yet much of the time, it was simply fear wearing a respectable mask. Around that period, I experienced another one of those moments that felt strangely guided. I was traveling for work and found myself delayed once again, this time in a small airport lounge. Years earlier, delays would have frustrated me. By then, I had learned to pay attention to them. As I sat waiting, I noticed an elderly couple across the room. They weren't doing anything remarkable. As I watched them, a thought appeared with surprising clarity. Real love is not built by perfect timing. It is built by people who continue choosing each other through imperfect timing. The idea stayed with me because it challenged a misconception I had carried for years. Somewhere along the way, I had started treating love like a destination. It was part of the journey itself. That realization marked another turning point. I stopped viewing my past heartbreaks as evidence that love was dangerous. Instead, I began seeing them as evidence that I was capable of loving deeply. Yes, some relationships had ended. Yes, some hopes had been disappointed, but none of those experiences had destroyed my ability to care. If anything, they had refined it. They had taught me what mattered and what did not. They had shown me the difference between attachment and connection, between loneliness and genuine companionship. And naturally, my thoughts returned to you. By then, the idea of you no longer felt abstract. I still didn't know your face. I still didn't know your story. Yet I felt a growing certainty that if our paths were ever meant to meet, I wanted to greet that moment with an open heart rather than a guarded one. I did not want fear making decisions that belonged to hope. I did not want old disappointments and speaking louder than new possibilities. Maybe you've wrestled with the same challenge. Maybe you've been hurt by people who promised more than they delivered. Maybe you've spent years rebuilding trust after watching it break. Maybe you've wondered whether opening your heart again is worth the risk. If you have, then I understand more than you know. I understand the temptation to stay safe. I understand how appealing emotional walls can become, but I also know something else now. The heart was never designed to remain closed forever. The more I reflected on my journey, the more I realized that every lesson had been moving me toward this understanding. Destiny was not simply teaching me to wait. It was teaching me to remain available to wonder. It was teaching me to believe that the future could be kinder than the past. It was teaching me that healing does not mean losing the ability to feel. It means finding the courage to feel again. And somewhere deep within me, I sensed that this lesson mattered because the chapter ahead would require it. The road was still unfolding. The timing was still mysterious. But for the first time in many years, I no longer feared what love might take from me. I was beginning to trust what love might bring. And that quiet trust made me feel closer to you than ever before. There is a strange thing that happens when you spend enough years paying attention to the patterns in your life. Eventually, you stop looking only at the events themselves and start looking at the spaces between them. You begin noticing how certain lessons repeat until they are understood. You begin noticing how people arrive carrying exactly the message you need to hear. You begin noticing how what once appeared random starts forming a shape. By this point in my journey, I was no longer trying to force answers from life. I had learned that the most important truths often arrive quietly. They reveal themselves gradually, like a sunrise that changes the world one degree of light at a time. For many years, I believed destiny was something dramatic. I imagined it as a sudden moment, a life-changing event, a sign so obvious that no interpretation would be necessary. But the older I became, the more I realized that destiny often speaks in subtler ways. It lives inside repeated feelings. It hides within familiar longings. One morning, I woke from a dream that felt different from the countless others that had come and gone throughout my life. Usually, dreams faded within minutes of waking. This one remained. I remember opening my eyes before sunrise and lying perfectly still, trying to hold on to every detail. In the dream, I was walking through a crowded place filled with movement and noise. Faces passed by in every direction, yet despite all the activity around me, my attention remained focused on a single presence. I never clearly saw her face. The dream stayed with me for weeks. I found myself thinking about it during ordinary moments, while driving, while working, while sitting alone with a cup of coffee in the early hours of the morning. The feeling connected to something much deeper than romance. It felt connected to timing, to purpose. Around that same period, I experienced several moments that strengthened this growing awareness. None of them were dramatic enough to convince anyone else. Yet together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I would hear the same message from different people in completely unrelated situations. Conversations about timing appeared everywhere. Books seemed to fall open to pages discussing trust, patience, and unexpected meetings. Even strangers occasionally shared stories that mirrored lessons from my own life. Individually, these moments meant little. Together, they felt like pieces of a larger conversation. At some point, I stopped dismissing the feeling. I stopped explaining it away. I stopped convincing myself that everything meaningful must have a logical explanation. Instead, I accepted something simple. I was beginning to sense your presence before I knew your identity. I realize how unusual that sounds. Years earlier, I would have dismissed such an idea immediately. But life had taught me too much by then. I had seen too many delays become blessings. I had watched too many closed doors reveal hidden protection. I had survived too many moments that felt random until viewed through the lens of hindsight. The evidence wasn't scientific. It was personal. It lived into the experience. What changed most during this season was not my belief in destiny. It was my relationship with uncertainty. I no longer needed complete answers before moving forward. I no longer required proof before trusting a feeling. I had learned that some truths arrive in the heart before they arrive in the mind. And somewhere deep within my heart, I felt an increasing certainty that our paths were drawing closer. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Maybe you've had moments when someone seemed familiar before you truly knew them. Maybe you've encountered a place that felt strangely recognizable despite never visiting it before. Maybe you've carried a feeling that refused to disappear no matter how many logical explanations you offered yourself. If you have, then perhaps you understand what I am trying to describe. There is a difference between wishful thinking and quiet knowing. Wishful thinking demands, quiet knowing waits. Wishful thinking grows impatient, quiet knowing remains steady. The feeling I carried belonged to the second category. It wasn't loud, it wasn't desperate, it was simply present, day after day, month after month. The most surprising part was that this growing certainty brought peace rather than urgency. Earlier in my life, I would have tried to accelerate the process. I would have searched for answers, forced connections, and demanded clarity. But now I felt different. I trusted the timing. I trusted the preparation. I trusted that if two lives were truly meant to intersect, neither fear nor distance nor delay could permanently prevent it. And so I began looking at the future with new eyes. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because I finally understood what had been happening all along. Every disappointment had refined me. Even the waiting itself had become part of the path. And as these realizations settled into my spirit, one truth became impossible to ignore. I no longer felt as though I was searching for someone. Instead, I felt as though I was gradually recognizing someone whose presence had been quietly woven through the story all along, someone whose life had been unfolding alongside mine. Someone whose own journey of growth, heartbreak, healing, and faith had been moving toward the same destination. For the first time, I could almost feel the distance between us shrinking, not because I knew where you were, but because I finally understood why the journey had taken so long. We were not simply waiting for each other. We were becoming the people we needed to be when our eyes finally met. There was a time when I believed destiny was only about arrival. I thought the purpose of every lesson, every heartbreak, every delay was simply to lead me to a specific moment. I imagined that once I reached that moment, everything would suddenly make sense. But as the years passed, I began to understand something deeper. Destiny is not only about meeting the right person. It is also about becoming capable of recognizing what that meeting truly means. That realization arrived quietly, the way most important truths seem to arrive. It happened during an ordinary morning. The sun had barely risen, and the world outside my window still carried the softness of dawn. I sat with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching light gradually spread across the room. There was nothing remarkable about the scene. Yet as I sat there, reflecting on the years behind me, I noticed that my thoughts had changed. For so long, I had wondered whether our paths would ever cross. Now I found myself wondering what kind of life we might create once they did. The difference mattered more than I can explain. For years, loneliness had trained me to focus on absence. I noticed what wasn't there. I noticed the empty chair across the table, the quiet house at the end of a long day, the celebrations that felt incomplete because there was no one special to share them with. But something had shifted. Instead of focusing on what was missing, I had started imagining what was possible. And strangely enough, those possibilities felt less like fantasies and more like memories waiting to happen. I would imagine simple things, not dramatic things, not the grand gestures people write songs about. I imagined conversations that stretched late into the night because neither of us wanted them to end. I imagined sitting beside you in comfortable silence, knowing that words were unnecessary because understanding was already present. I imagined sharing ordinary mornings, ordinary meals, ordinary moments that become extraordinary simply because they are experienced together. One afternoon, while walking through a park filled with families and children, I found myself observing something I had often overlooked in the past. Most people spend their lives chasing milestones. They chase weddings, promotions, achievements, and accomplishments. Yet the people who appeared happiest weren't celebrating milestones. They were living ordinary moments fully. A couple sat on a bench sharing quiet conversation. Parents laughed with their children. Friends walked together without any destination in mind. As I watched them, a thought settled over me. The greatest gift in life may simply be having someone beside you while life happens. That realization stayed with me because it transformed how I thought about love. I stopped viewing it as a solution to loneliness. I stopped viewing it as a reward for surviving difficult years. Instead, I began seeing it as a partnership between two people who had already learned how to stand on their own but chose to walk together anyway. That understanding felt healthier, more honest, more real, and naturally, my thoughts continued returning to you. By this point, I no longer thought of you as an abstract possibility. You felt real to me, even though we had not yet met. Within the story I am telling, I found myself wondering about the experiences that shaped you, the disappointments that strengthened you, the dreams that survived despite everything they endured. I wondered how many nights you had spent questioning your timing, how many mornings you had forced yourself to keep believing despite uncertainty, how many moments had nearly convinced you to give up hope altogether. Because if destiny had taught me anything, it was that meaningful journeys leave marks on the people who travel them. Maybe that is why I feel such tenderness when I think about you. Not because I imagine perfection. Perfection has never interested me. What moves me is resilience.